Professor Lee, I was referring to the fact that you're fluent in Mandarin. USC students come from extremely diverse cultural and religious backgrounds. As you know, most of us at USC know, we are one of the number 1 or 2 schools in the country in terms of our international students, as well as some of the undergraduate diversity that's domestic as well. Would you mind sharing a bit about your background and how you came to hold the religious views that you currently hold?
Sure. Hey, how are you? I can't see anybody, so
These are very bright lights.
it's a pleasure to meet you. I was born in Taiwan, and hey, there's a few there. So my parents were born in China, so they met as freshmen in the university in Taiwan. So I'm MIT, like made in Taiwan. Right? So, and so in Chinese vernacular. And so at 9 years old, I came over to Canada, and so I grew up in a Canadian culture. So I was not in a Christian family when I grew up. My parents were not Christian. Then my mother became a Christian, so my father, though, was an incredibly articulate, thoughtful man who was an atheist. And so I grew up confused. And by the time I got to college, I was pretty thoroughly agnostic, by which I mean, like, I wasn't sure whether God existed, but it didn't seem to matter very much to me. So I sort of came to some sort of truce with God, basically. I figured, he's never introduced himself to me, even if he existed. So I didn't feel like I had a sense of obligation to him. And if I tried to do my best, and if a God like that is going to send people to hell, then I wasn't going to worship him anyway. So that was the way I thought about it. And really, there were so many interesting things growing up. It just never really occurred to me that it was that relevant to seek out sort of something else. But then, I went to undergrad at University of Waterloo. In my 3rd or 4th year, several things impacted me. One was that my father got cancer, and then he was paralyzed. And the other was I had a few failed romances, is the nicest way to put it. So botched up relationships, right? And sometimes I think it's maybe the other person's fault. Sometimes, actually, the worst part is when I feel like I had a role in it. But through that process, I discovered that I'm actually not in control of some of the most important things in my life. Like, for example, my own emotions, my anger, my lust, my feelings. And I started to wonder, I started to search for God. I started to wonder what life is about. After I graduated at the age of 24, I was in a Chinese church, and you wonder how I got into a Chinese church, because I really was culturally very not so Chinese by that time. But I was invited by my mom, and my father had just become a Christian, and I thought he was just trying to please my mom, But eventually, I won't go into all the details, but I actually found myself listening to a message in Chinese. And they were doing Bible studies, and that first night, the Bible study was, the subject was about sin. And there was this one verse in there that I'd always thought that, that Christians are nice people, they're just not too bright. And so I go to Bible studies, ask a few questions just to confirm my suspicions that they were not too bright. But that night they were studying this thing, and there was this one verse that says, it was Romans, says 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And that night, for whatever reason, I read that verse and I thought, all means everyone, and I'm a proper subset. So that means that I have sinned And for some reason, that notion did not seem totally ridiculous, like a lot of other things that I heard. So I started asking serious questions, and over the process of several days, I found that I was at a point where I really, I was invited to whether I would be willing to open myself to God. I never thought it was possible to have dialogues with the divine or anything like that. But when I was invited, that moment I started to realize that that was the thing I most wanted. And so that was a big turning point in my life. And actually, it shaped basically everything that followed. It was a very, for me, it was emotional, it was volitional, it was eye-opening. It was literally, I started to see things differently. So I started to realize that, the Bible that I couldn't stand, I couldn't read 2 sentences without going, this is ridiculous. I couldn't put it down. It was as if it was an encrypted code that actually somebody decrypted for me, and I couldn't put it down. And I started to realize things were changing, and I started to discover that so many ways that I looked at life wasn't quite on target. And I started to realize that, well, it's almost like the Matrix, like you sort of see numbers or something. And then you can't pretend you don't see it anymore. And I discovered, so people ask me, why am I a Christian? I think it's not because, I was weak and I needed a crux or anything. It's just because it's the frame through which I see everything. It's reality. It's either true or not true. A lot of the assertions in Christianity are either true or not true. And for me, the awareness that they are true shaped everything. It shaped what I decided to do, which is to become a teacher and a professor. It shaped how I made choices about what's important, what's not important, how I view the value of human beings, how I look at the role of relationships in my life, how I chose to allocate my time, and sort of everything, and who I decide to marry, among a number of other things. So just very quickly, just to give you a little bit of background on where I came from.
That's really helpful, and it sounds like that time at 24 was really a critical turning point for you. And Professor Wertman, I don't know if you had just one turning point or if you had a similar kind of story. What's your kind of coming to this cultural and religious background and its influence on you?
Sure. So I'm not Christian. I was born and raised Jewish. I was born in, if anybody's Jewish, the perfect definition of the cultural Jewish
I was going to ask
household, meaning that my grandparents were actually what was called workman circle Jews, which were not religious, communists actually, socialist. But we were a family that celebrated Passover, and that was about it. I was the third of 3 boys, and my mother decided that she wanted to go back to work. And the only school that would keep me for lunch was a yeshiva, which was a religious school. So my brothers, who went to secular public school, and they were off on their way, I'm off in religious school, in elementary school, and my life becomes the local synagogue, where I am the junior rabbi, not knowing that my parents weren't members even, that I just was hanging out there. I thought it was mine. And sort of grew up that way, where Judaism was, it's almost different. Judaism is my very basic identity. Who I am. If you ask me who I am, I think my first answer would be, I'm a Jew. My second answer would be, I'm a father, I'm a husband, and then I'm a teacher, or a professional. For me, I think I went through the same sort of life cycle that I think many people do, which is it's often, I really think that genetically we're built in a way that when we hit our 20s, God wants us to believe that we control our own lives so that we can set up our families and do all that. And it's very hard to sort of believe that there's somebody else, some other power involved. I'm on top of this. Finals are coming up. It's my problem. I got to get a job. It's my problem. Later, started working. In my mid-30s, my middle brother, who was my closest friend in the world, passed away in my arms. And I really had a hard time with God at that point. And I read a book, I read a book by Harold Kushner, and Harold Kushner wrote this book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And it's not, very interesting, it's not if bad things happen to good people, it's when bad things, because bad things happen to good people. And he had this great theory that bothers very religious Jews, but I love, which is this notion of we all want God to be three things. We want God to be omnipotent, all-knowing. We want God to be all good and all-powerful. Yet, if bad things happen to good people, God can really be only three of those. Two of those three. And the conclusion that Kushner comes to is that God is all good, God is all-knowing, but God is not all-powerful. Meaning that God is not going to determine what I do tomorrow morning. And that if I really want to fulfill that God is all-powerful for me, the question was, what was I going to do in my life? How was I going to be, and it's very Jewish, but how was I going to be the hand of God? That you want to know how God acts in the world, look at how people act in the world. And at that point, I went headlong into study. And I spent the next 10 years of my life, while working, reading nothing but religious books. So I spent the first 7 years of that studying Judaism, Torah, Talmud, with rabbis, flying to Israel, doing fellowships. I really dug all in. 7 years later, I said, okay, I need to know what else is going on. Spent the next year and a half studying Christianity, Catholicism, and then spent the next couple of years studying Eastern religions. Fell in love with the mystics, spent another couple of years, at least in books, living with the mystics of every religion. But what I kept seeing in all of what I was reading was that none of what was going on, none of what I was reading had anything to do with what was going on while I was reading. And when I would sit in synagogue and pray, I would look and I would go, none of what I'm praying about is happening in this building. The question is, what do I do when I leave? And it seemed to me that if I was going to be, and this was deep inside me forever, if I was going to be the person that I saw myself as, if I was going to be true to my beliefs, I really needed to devote my life to making other people's lives better. And that's when I literally, in my rabbi's office, walked in one morning and said, I'm quitting my job on Wall Street and I'm going to go help the homeless. So that's what I did.
So cool.
That's an incredible story. And you're allowed to say it's cool, because it is really cool. And I really, the thing that really struck me about both of y'all's stories, and I should say I went to kindergarten at the Jewish Community Center for a very similar reason, right? I was 4 years old and I could read, and my parents were like, we're not going to keep her out of school, we're going to put her in school. The only kindergarten that took 4-year-olds was the JCC. Yeah. And so, and then my dad was like, Chinese language school on Saturday. Well, God, yes, we want her to have that. So that's what I did all of second grade. Every Saturday. I still remember 3 words, but that's it. But
so just, you can sit in all of our chairs.
I try to, right? But no, what I really find interesting about this is that our parents had these both kind of instrumental reasons for kind of coming to faith or not coming to faith in our childhood. But it was also very much an individual journey, right? So the parents can be helpful, parents can be influential, but parents, ultimately, we have to make the decision for ourselves. And so I wanted to link that to kind of a conversation about success. So if we think about success in the same way, right, we kind of have these cultural notions of what it means to be successful, but ultimately we have to kind of grapple with what it means to be successful on our own. And so I guess, Professor Wertman, I'll begin with you, because you just talked about, I'm going to walk away from a very lucrative position and help people. And it sounds like, that definition, and the mystics are just, I think they're especially attractive to academics. But how did that really reshape your definition of success?
Sure. So I hate the word success because the media has defined success for us. And I always tell people, and there are still some magazine stands left in the world, if you want to know how the world defines success, go to a magazine stand and see who they put on the cover. And what it is people who are freakishly pretty, freakishly tall, athletic, or made a lot of money. And then becomes this definition in hero worship. I have a lot of problems with that because I really believe that it takes enormous courage, and it's a message I send at this time of year to every graduate, undergrad especially, is to have the courage to define success for yourself. So here is my thing, and I've said this many times, and I bore myself with it. But the truth is that I looked at myself from a very young age and said, okay, look, I was born white, male, in America. Right there, I have an advantage over 95% of the world, if not more. I mean, just those three things. I was born with parents who cared about education and made it a priority in my life. My dad worked 3 jobs so we could go to these schools. My brothers and I had different schools, but we could go. I was born with a high IQ. I was born with the ability to BS. I was born with, as I always put it, a set of looks that doesn't make people throw up when they have lunch with me. I gag a little, but nobody else. But the truth is that none of those had anything to do with me. Now, when I talk to secular groups, I say it's the universe or the lottery. To me, it's God. And I do not believe that God gave me these things so that I could maximize personal income. Like, that's it, Adlai, you won the lottery. Here, go make a lot of money. That's your thing. To me, it seemed incumbent on me that if I was going to be any version of accomplished, a word I use more, or successful with that starting point, I had to use all of those God-given things to make other people's lives better. I just couldn't live with myself with the idea of this is all here just for me so I can have more and more and more. And to me, the reason I know I'm accomplished, or if I could ever call myself successful, it's because of the impact I've had on others. It has nothing to do with my bank account or my car or my house. I mean, I look at my kids and see that by the way, I have a daughter who's graduating from USC in 5 weeks with some of you, and I have a daughter who's at Cal, and I have a son who just got into Thornton last week.
Great.
So
Congrats
fight
to
on. I
him.
have 2 Trojans in my family. But it seems to me that you really have to make these decisions as to what success means to you. And this school, the school you teach at, they do a really good job at defining success for you. It's that corporate job. It's high pay. It's McKinsey and Morgan Stanley. That's success. And the answer is that's other people's success. Your success has to come from your own heart. We're taught, and we try to figure it all out in our heads. But the real truth is that success is not a head conversation. Success is a heart conversation. And you have to get quiet to figure that one out.
Yeah, Professor Lee, I wanted to ask a slightly different version of the question to you because, again, Stanford also has a really excellent reputation in Silicon Valley in general for entrepreneurship. So, it's absolutely McKinsey, it's absolutely all these other things, but it's also somehow you can do it on your own, right? And at the same time, we know that most of these, successful startups are not on your own, right? There are small pairs and groups of folks who kind of come together. And so I'm wondering about this idea of success being also cultural in the sense of place, right? So this Silicon Valley model kind of surrounds the Stanford School of Business. And so how much of the conversation is around our country is having this thing that says higher education means, to be successful means you have to come out with a job, or you have to come up with a successful business idea in some way, shape, or form. So it's cultural in that way, as opposed to cultural meaning, racial or ethnic or religious.
So, I was going to...
Of course, you can answer it the other way, too.
I was going to ask Professor Wertman another question about his faith after he made that decision to go from... But let me go back to this topic here about success. So, I think that external, your environment does shape to the extent to which you think something is successful or not successful, the way you think about what success looks like. But let's just go back more basically and just ask yourself, what is success, right? Is success a good thing? Like, how many of you don't want to be successful? Just raise your hand and let me know so I can see. Right? We all want to be successful, but what about being a successful liar, a successful cheat, a successful terrorist, right? Like, success is just, by definition, the attainment of a goal. And this is why I think Professor Wertman said, success is a heart thing, because it has to do with your goal. Success is the attainment of a goal. The question is how worthwhile your goal is. So the success of a knife is to cut because it was designed to cut. The success of a racehorse is to run because it was bred to run. The success of USC's football coach, there's this team that you'd like to beat. Yeah, well, there's a few, but we have one in our town too that we like that. So, and then go to the Rose Bowl, right? That's success, right? So win the Rose Bowl. But what about a human being? What does it mean to be a successful human being? Or, the Bible actually definitely does not use the word success. It uses more like a word like faithful, right? That's because, at least in my worldview, there is a God. And if this God created you, then it's best to ask him what you're designed for, right? And actually looking for that and then investing heavily in it is actually what we call faithful, right? But to do this, you need to have some framework, some cogent commitment to a metaphysical view of reality. The type of questions that the night security guard asks you when he finds you, like, who are you? What are you doing here? And where are you going? Right? The questions that you have asked when you're growing up, but you may not think there's an answer to, but you spend the rest of your life looking for and wrestling with. So when you get to those issues, I think it's so incredibly important that we have these conversations on campus, because it forces you to think, what is my worldview? Why do I believe it? What happens after death? And what do I mean by living well? Those things are exactly heart issues, because they are not the how-tos. And what I'm really worried about is in so many campuses now, we are so siloed by our technical knowledge that we're not actually spending a lot of time having a conversation about wisdom, which is how you apply that knowledge to live well. And so even though I think your question was about how much of your sense of success is coming from around you, I would also feel that so much of it is coming from what you've spent enough time wrestling with this issue of what it means to do something meaningful, right? And that's one reason why we're here, to be able to have these conversations and to ask why you believe what you believe, and how does that affect how you live? Sorry.
It's true, but I'm just thinking. So my mom is in this crisis of faith because my dad passed away, so very similar to you losing your brother. She's like, I'm good, right? Yeah, I was raised Catholic, yeah, I have that, but I'm done with God. I've had it up to here,
right,
with the God thing.
Right.
And so,
because
I also wonder,
tragedy.
Right, I think it's true about the tragedy, but I think even before that, she was a skeptic. And so if I'm the skeptical person, right, or if I'm the School of Medicine person, I'm like, okay, it's a hard decision. I get that. That's like a cardiovascular thing, right? Like, I can get that. I can wrap my mind around that. And so I guess I want to provocatively ask both of you, must it be a spiritual or religious kind of heart conversation? Or can it just be a heart conversation that is without this idea of spirituality or, religion, kind of qua religion?
So what's an example of a heart conversation in which you do not invoke something beyond?
Something beyond. So thinking through, for example, if we think about someplace like USC, and I'm sure Stanford has the same thing, we have a tremendous amount of service learning opportunities, right? We tutor plenty of kids, we do all kinds of incredible stuff in the schools here. And I could see someone having that experience and it really just transforming, right? I mean, like more than just I'm gonna go do Teach for America. Like, no, this has literally transformed my life and I want to do something different with it because I had this experience with this one eighth grader or this one third grader or this set of third graders. And so I think that experience would lead to a heart conversation, but I don't know that they would necessarily attribute that to God placed those people in my life, or you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I mean, what would you say to that more skeptical, kind of person?
Yeah, so we took different journeys, but I admire what you did going to do the work that you've done with the homeless, and that's why I was very curious about what you thought the impact was of that on your spirituality, on your life. Do you feel any different, or do you feel that? How do you feel about that? Never mind what you've done for other people. How do you feel about it?
So as an adult, going back to synagogue after having spent a lot of years out of synagogue when I was on the road for 18 years as a banker, or 15 years. When I went back to synagogue, I had this problem. I walked in to say the first prayer, and the first prayer said, "Oh God, please." And right in my mind went to this childhood vision of God as this old white man sitting with a beard in a chair, and I was like, come on, that's bullshit. So that's not going to work for me. And what I did for the next couple of years is I went to synagogue every Friday, every Saturday, and I replaced the word God with the universe.
Interesting.
And I just came in and I said, thank you, universe, for me getting up this morning. And please, universe, provide this. And then after a couple of years of that, I swapped the word back to God.
Why is
because
that?
To me, because to me it's interchange. It doesn't matter whether, to me it doesn't matter, and this is sort of a Jewish versus Christian, belief versus behavior, 3 Bs kind of thing, belonging, belief, and behavior. It doesn't really matter to me. It matters to me that I believe I'm connected to something bigger, that I believe that there is something beyond me. So whether I want to call that a quantum physics universe, or whether I want to call that Jesus, or whether I want to call it Buddha, or, it doesn't really, because we all have these different names for God. I don't think it really matters. I think the real question to me was, what did I feel? I felt and still feel in my work that I do here at USC, training students to do work in the world, in society, to solve societal problems, that I am connected to the universe. I used to say that my old job on Wall Street, I got paid a lot of money to knock down doors. That I would walk into buildings, and you get it, they would say to you, Adlai, there's a deal on the other side of that door, and I would just smash the door down. And then I got to Skid Row, and doors started opening. It was like Star Trek, or it was Star Trek or the supermarket. For me, it's Star Trek. For you, it's the supermarket, where I just walk and doors fly open, and that's the way my life has been. Is that sort of there's a guiding path towards what I do, and the truth is if I walk up to a door that's locked, I sort of know it's the wrong door, and just step around it. So to me, being in the flow, being in that connection, to me it's God, but it doesn't need to be in somebody else, that word.
So this is great. So if I were to interpret what you and sort of reflect on what I have done, I also feel like the idea is to get to know God and to do what He tells me to do, essentially. But the funny thing is, instead of depersonalizing, my journey was actually more towards a much more specific, much more personalized relationship with God. Previously, when I prayed, when I cared to pray, I was praying to something. After a while, after I became a Christian, I was much more focused on, so I guess it doesn't really matter what I call Him unless He has a preference what I call Him, right? So then it depends on revelation. In other words, if He never shows me what He cares or not, and then He doesn't care. But if I felt that He did show me, then I sort of have to reflect on that and maybe respond to that. And in my case, the thing that really sort of sort of shook me to the root is this sudden awareness that, what the Bible told us about sort of the breach, between God and man is critical to sort of finding meaning in this entire journey, to me. It also put into context why God is willing to come and die as a atonement for something that was so deep. And what I saw was actually things in me that I wish I actually previously didn't want to see, to be honest, because I don't really want to have a good close look at the mirror, because what if I can't live with what I see? But it is actually in the liberating sense of forgiveness that I came to realize that I dared to look. And somehow in that whole process, I retrieved both a sense of my dignity as well as a sense of my depravity. And it was all right because the relationship was reconciled. So this is sort of my explaining of how I felt. What did I do? Well, I was very happy. When I became a Christian, I previously couldn't understand the Bible. Then I started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. And then I felt guilty that I was using my time as a young accountant in a public accounting firm reading the Bible. So I screwed up the courage and went to resign because I felt like I should go to seminary. And this is where things get really wacky, because I go to my boss, who was the head of national auditing in a largest accounting firm in Canada, and I was a national researcher. I was just like a new CA. I finally didn't even know how to explain it. I just said, I had this experience in August, and I know I promised to be here for 3 years, but I really feel like I'm going to go study in seminary, and I don't know what else is next, but I thought I'd better tell you first so you can make arrangements. So it was terrifying, honestly. And then he said, let's have lunch. So we had lunch, we talked, and then he said, Charles, I don't know how to tell you this, but 2.5 years ago, the same exact thing happened to me. Right, this tall Englishman. Wow. He said, we went to an Anglican church. I never actually believed anything, but I just sort of went because everybody went. My wife and I did this, and then my wife suddenly believed, and she was radically different. And so I thought she was kind of crazy, and then I believed. And then when I believed, the first thing I thought of was I should resign. I'm sitting there thinking, this is not happening. This is like, that's not what I expected. And then in that process, he said, I started taking seminary classes at night. In Toronto, there are these seminaries. Maybe you should think about doing that. Maybe you don't necessarily want. So I felt like God was just talking to me. I felt like it was like, and then I said, okay. And then I thought, well, let me think about that. And he says, well, do you want me to put it on the record that we, I said, well, maybe I should think about it, like you said. And during that process, I started attending seminary at night. I met my wife, and we started attending seminary together. And I started serving at the church, and I started teaching a bunch of young kids. They were junior high kids. I said, what do you guys want to learn? They said, we want to learn about dating. I said, well, I don't think that's in the curriculum, but all right, but I can tell you how not to do it. So then we hit it off, and suddenly I discovered by the end of that process that I think I should be a teacher, because I did so little, and I made such a big difference. And so, God leads in so many different ways, but I felt, that, and in the process, right, I think that I found that the person that emerged, the Jesus that emerged from the New Testament scriptures, it was like a voice that was speaking 2,000 years through and addressing needs and questions that I didn't even know I had. And so then it seemed to me like that was just part of my job. I couldn't understand why people who really believed that weren't standing in the street corners, So I stood in the street corner in Chinatown, Toronto, starting to hand out pamphlets.
Can I ask you a question, though?
Yeah.
So you went to seminary and you had this profound experience, and it became that you
It's a
realized
before
you should
seminary, yes.
you should become a teacher. Why not why become a teacher of what you did become a teacher of?
Right, right.
So could you talk a little bit
So,
about
yeah,
going and get your PhD?
Right, right.
And
So,
why and,
so
yeah.
just to get, so
Yeah.
in terms of chronology, I sought to resign. I was encouraged to think about it. I spent time thinking about it. I finished my 3 years at that firm. Then I went to seminary. And by then, I was pretty clear that I was likely going to be a layman and that I was likely going to be on campuses. And so I was going to teach, so what are they going to give me a degree in? Oh, you're an accountant, why don't you get a PhD in accounting? That seemed to make sense. So I actually did not, incredibly, I applied to just one school because somebody said Cornell is a pretty good place and it's not far from home. I had a good conversation with the person. He said, you know, if we talked for 15, 20 minutes, asked me some questions. He says, you know, if you apply, we'll probably let you in. I think we'll let you in. So I looked at my wife and I said, he said he'll let me in. She said, yeah, I heard that. So when I'm driving home, I said, yeah, forget about applying anywhere else. You know, I just wanted, so it was really sort of the beginning of a really incredible journey. And mostly all I basically said was, you know, where do you want me to be? What should I do? And then over time, you just sort of meander through. And so a few years ago, the graduating class at Stanford, the MBAs asked me to give one of the last lectures, you know, they invite. The way to get a professor to do anything is just say, you know, we like to invite a beloved professor to do blah, blah, blah. Then you tell him he's a beloved professor, he'll do whatever you want to do. So anyway, so you end up, you go, and so I was sharing with them sort of, and the title of the talk was My Improbable Journey to Accidental Success. And it was just sort of the sequence of decisions, the things that probably wouldn't have made sense, but ended up working out. I just feel like if you are where you should be, there's a wellness in your soul. What is interesting is the unease that is not there when you're not where you should be. Mm-hmm. To me, that hunger says a lot about where home is and what God expects from us, whether you're a Christian or not.
I think you raise a really good point about that kind of feeling you can get in the pit of your stomach, right? So if the conversation about what's the meaning is, you know, and what success is really a heart conversation, sometimes you get that feeling in the pit of your stomach about, this is not the right thing.
Yeah,
you know?
and there are so many people. You know, it's funny because Professor Wertman looked at his, you know, job as sort of knocking down doors. I actually enjoy my job. I enjoyed being a professor, enjoyed being a teacher, and I enjoyed my time in industry. And I enjoyed even more coming back. So it's a funny thing, right? So God sort of leads you in places, and it's pretty unlikely if you're at sort of place where you should be that, like, you know, like if you're Steph Curry, you're probably not going to be spending your time teaching accounting. I mean, you just have better fish to fry, right? So I mean, different people are called to do different things. Is the way I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about both of the things, both of you just talked about, this idea of doors opening, right? And kind of the difficult thing about life is that, you know, it makes so much sense going backwards, looking back on what happened, but it has to be lived forward, right? So you don't necessarily know that those doors are going to open. And I wanted to talk about the flip side of success, which is failure. And you know, so far we've had this lovely conversation about how we were very high-powered and very successful in all the things that we did in life. And I wanted to kind of talk about a time where you faced a great personal or professional failure, and kind of how you got through that. And that kind of retrospective thing, did you know it in the pit of your stomach as you were doing it? Or is it only kind of, you know, you were surprised that the failure happened? So could you talk, Professor Wertman, why don't you start off, you know, by kind of just talking about that failure and how you handled it, especially if there are students in the audience who might have
Sure.
gone through something similar.
Professionally, my failure was 18 years on Wall Street. That was a professional failure. It was a waste of 18 years of my life. My brother got sick, and my oldest brother was a jazz musician. My middle brother was a dentist. My middle brother got sick, and I was called to the hospital when he got sick. And everybody looked at me and said, so go, you fix things, Adlai, go fix this. And 23 days later, after airlifting him around the country and all of that, he died. And I took that as a personal failure. 2 years ago, my oldest brother got cancer and didn't call me until it was late. And I flew out. He was already stage 4. I literally kidnapped him, took him to Dana-Farber, and lived with him for 3 months when he went through treatments, and he passed away. I think, even though I don't think I could have done anything differently, I will always consider those to be failures of mine. And that, I think those are the ones that keep me humble and keep me waking up every day saying, I'm not in control here. And the only thing I can control is what I do today, what kind of person I am with other people, what I am when somebody comes into my office. I have this theory about, so I'll go back to Hebrew real quick. There is, I'm sort of off track here, but in Hebrew, the word in the Bible, melech and malach, same root, is one means angel and the other one means messenger.
Means what?
Messenger. And there's a theory that I read years ago by some mystic that anybody who comes into your life who has something to teach you is an angel. And since I've read that, I treat every single person I meet, whoever student, any person who walks into my life, and I'm one of these people, I have 30 to 40 meetings a week, just without a doubt, week after week, meeting people. And I really am the most curious person in the world because I wonder what message they have for me. And because, I worked on Skid Row for 8 years, and I had people die in my office. People I got to know very well were dying all around me. Lives were being just the worst. And I just kept believing everybody's an angel. It's all a message, and whatever the next person who walks through my door has to tell me is not necessarily going to change my life. It's going to change another person's life. So I think I look at failures, all of it, as messages from God, and the question is, it's stored away somewhere to be used, somewhere to make a difference, to make somebody else's life better.
I like that idea of, there's a message in it, because I think one of the things we can think about failure is, of course, learning from failure, right? Learning from learning the lesson that's contained within it. But I also know, Professor Lee, when Christians talk about failure, if you will, in a Christian perspective, sometimes failure is not so much failure as it is, we're being disciplined, or, there's always that thing that coaches like to tell you, look behind you, that's the line, you just crossed it, And so I know a lot of Christians sometimes talk about discipline, right? So God will discipline us and kind of say, no, there's a boundary here for a reason. And, this is how, so you might be publicly perceiving it as failure, or secularly perceiving it as failure is probably the better way to put it. But that there is a kind of specific kind of Christian approach to understanding failure as having some broader meaning as well.
Yeah, so again, the Professor Wallen's narrative it resonates with me because having someone close to you die and you feel helpless about it is an incredibly powerful experience. Both my parents passed away pretty young, and my mother passed away. She was very close. We were very close because she was a professor, and she's one of those people who look at me and think there's nothing wrong. I mean, one of those people, the only person actually, but almost.
We all need at least one of those.
Yeah, right. But it's interesting that you see that as a failure, because when I look at something like that, I probably wouldn't have thought of it as a failure, just because, I look at the results are not mine, though the effort is. And I would find it difficult in my conversation with God, asking why, especially, when my mom is a strong believer. When she was diagnosed with cancer, we prayed that she would be healed, and then when she was not healed, we prayed that when she was terminal, we prayed that she would not suffer much, and she got shingles.
It's a very painful disease if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah, so it's this nerve thing. So then when she, at her funeral, I asked the presiding, well, why is there so much pain? Why is there so much suffering? Why was that necessary? Probably the sort of things you might ask God. He said something that was very helpful to me. He said, Charles, there's so much suffering so that we know that we live in a rotten world. So that we know we live in a rotten world. I thought to myself, yeah. When we look at this world, sometimes we say, if there's no 911, if there's no Holocaust, if there's no tsunami in Japan and this sort of stuff, how would a loving God tolerate such a thing? But what about the little stuff? The stuff we call little. The stuff that we do not do, which we know we should do, the things that we do that we know we should not do. I mean, there's no such thing as sanitized sin. And basically, what we'd like to do is just sort of dismiss some of those things and say, well, if God had fixed a few of those, that would be all right. But he did something much more dramatic. I mean, he suffered. He came, he gave himself, he showed us what it means, what love means. I mean, love, right? What is love, right? Love is relational, so you have to have two meanings. And love is sacrificial. How do you know you've ever been loved? It's because somebody paid a price for you. We measure love more by the cost paid than by the benefit received. People who have lots of money, the kid may not feel like they're loved because dad's got lots anyway. But I know my mom loved me because the night that I went to school, she spent all night up sewing. She's a busy professor. Because Waterloo's a cold place, right? She was sending me a blanket. She wanted me to bring the blanket. It was much harder for me to understand my father loved me because he was a typical Chinese guy. And, if you get a 95, he'll say, where's the other 5, right? So you guys might have had a fun.
That also happens.
You mean he was Jewish?
Right. And, I think that's the way they think love is, right? They think that's what love is. But, when my father got cancer and he was paralyzed, he had to have a surgery to have a tracheotomy, like a hole here. So when he talked, he had to plug the hole. And he would, when I come home, he'd be in a wheelchair, he'd say, how was your day? He was already a Christian. We spent the last 2 years after he became a Christian and before he died, were amazing years. I told him things that I dare not tell him my whole life. And he never told my mom, I hope. But we became close. And so I knew he loved me because he gave me his last breath. And so when you ask me about why I think God loves me, right, and why God might choose to become a man, right, some people say, well, why don't you just believe in the universe, believe in the logos, the right and the wrong? Why do you want to personal worship is the way my friend would ask me. It's so limiting. This is why does God want to be like a man? Why are you worshiping a man? And the main thing I could say is he wants to tell you he loves you. You think he's got infinite resources, but when he's hanging there in his last breath, and he had told you that that was what was necessary to reconcile you with God, it changes you. You suddenly look at love differently, and you look at God differently. And while we each have different ways to express that calling, once we have been touched, you cannot pretend you were not. And so I feel unfortunate because I feel like God gave me a job that I love. But I'm willing to say to him, like, if you want me to go do something else tomorrow, like, I'm very happy and willing to hang on. I'm willing to do that.
Can I ask a little, so if I imagine, it's been a long time since I've been a student, but I imagine if I'm sitting in the audience, again, whether I believe or not, without being too Oprah about it, are there like a couple of things you actually do? Like when something happens in your life and it's like, it might not be the greatest personal failure, the greatest profession, but it's like, wow, that didn't go the way I would have liked it to, or I would have wanted it to, right? What's your kind of mental calculus? Do you have a couple of things that you do? Like, do you turn to the Bible? Do you, read? Do you talk with somebody about it? Kind of, what are your strategies?
Take deep breaths.
Right,
Turn
right.
to Jerusalem. Pray 3 times a day.
Like I said, we are in California, not to get too new agey about it,
Yes.
but I think, it would be great to also think through like practical steps that people can take, when they're contending with these things. Because life gets so busy, it's so easy to just kind of say, wow, that didn't go the way I planned, and then on to the next thing, right? Without taking the time to process it, without taking the time to really come to terms with how, things might have gone differently or how you might like things to go better in the future.
Yeah. So not just failure, but anytime things don't turn the way you expect them to. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Way you,
And then Professor Wertman.
wasn't sure it was my turn, but if things don't, when you expect you expect things to turn, the thing to turn right and it goes left, right? There is this sense of, what's the deal, God? But I do think the process of walking with God is this process of letting go when you think that, God ought to have turned right and he turned left. And that includes things that have to do with your career and your resume, but includes much more than that. Right? This process of letting go is actually, part of what we call worship. I know that most of the time when I'm sure you guys go through lots of things where maybe even now you say, well, what is going on? This is like crazy. This is not this didn't seem like the deal that I signed up for. The book of Job is incredibly poetic. It's just an amazing book, but at the end of the day, this process of learning that God is God and you're not, while it's not easy, it is also ultimately very liberating, in my view, because we worry about a lot of things that that are not in our boundaries, that we think we ought to have gone this way and that way. And so to me, I think the process of dealing with things that are that require letting go is just a process of coming before God and acknowledging that there are times when he pulls rank, and I don't think it's easy, but I think that God cares, I think, more about who you are than what you do. So that process of going through these things, you have to trust that he's doing something important in those private grounds where it matters.
Professor Wertman?
Yeah. There's such a subtlety and maybe it's not that subtle in the different language that we use. And this question of a personal God, and I would say anthropomorphic, a God that's some white guy sitting somewhere.
I didn't say it was white,
Well,
might speak
the
Mandarin.
picture says so.
You never know.
That is really, when I look at it, I'm very jealous of Christians in that there is something great about having a personal relationship with a God that looks like me. And I always think Christians have this personal relationship with somebody that you can actually vision in person, and Jews have an unknowable, unseeable God, which is why there's 3 billion of you and like 8 of us. It's like, why wouldn't you? This is a really hard question for me because I really suck at making mistakes and failing. This is something I do not handle well internally. I mean, I fail really well. I'm just not good at dealing with it. It's in the Bible, God says that the reason God chose Moses as the leader is because Moses was wise and discerning. And I'm always so interested in why both of those words. Like, what's the difference? And I've spent a lot of time, way too much of my life, thinking about what's the difference between wisdom and discernment. I think wisdom comes from age. I think wisdom comes from experience. I think wisdom
That's very Chinese, actually.
Wisdom comes from making mistakes and learning from those. Discernment is which one of these is important and which one isn't. And I think for me, I beat myself up over all of the mistakes I make, but I think I've learned in life to be a little more discerning about still saying, is this one really important? Is this worth all of the anxiousness and trouble I'm going to put myself through? And I think ultimately the best thing that I got from growing older, I'm 56, I'm not that old, but so is that I've learned that not everything that happens is the single most important. Undergrads are like notoriously believing that what they're going to get on this, what job they're going to get, or what internship they're going to get is the single most important thing that's ever going to happen in their entire life. And if they don't get the right internship, then they're not going to get the right job. And if they don't get the right job, then they'll never get married, life will be over, and it's done. And that's it. And that's why FOMO, it's just FOMO fits perfectly into that. So therefore, I'll be a consultant because after being a consultant, I can do anything. I can do
YOLO.
TFA because after TFA, I can do anything. I don't have to decide today. But I think that one of the things that really has come up for me is this sleeping on it, understanding that, there's this great line that Seinfeld had where he said, my mother used to tell me all the time, don't eat all those Oreos or you'll ruin your appetite. And what she didn't tell me was there was another appetite right after that one. And I think it's the same for mistakes. It's sort of like, don't spend too much time on your mistakes. This is another mistake right after that one. It's the best I can do.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Bible's view on money. And certainly between Judaism and Christianity, but then also, I think there's a lot of kind of concern. I'm a political scientist. We have an election going on. I don't want to talk about the election. But, there are folks who are very, very critical of what happened on Wall Street after you left. But not too far after you left.
It was happening when I was there, don't worry. It's been happening for a long time.
But no, I really want to talk about this idea about the accumulation of wealth. And, you're both business school professors. So how do you kind of have your faith influence your business ethics in kind of a more broad way?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm the world's worst business school professor because what I teach is how to use business to solve social problems. Business as a force of good, business as a model. We teach business skills. The whole theory behind what I do is, when I was working on issues like homelessness, everybody at the table had any degree except a business degree. And my attitude was just, can't we just get a marketing major at this table with everybody else? And maybe we'll come up with a new idea. That was it. So I'm not really the best at this. I will say that there is nothing holy, there is nothing sustainable, there is nothing loving about this wealth problem that we have of all the wealth being in a handful of people and everybody else poor. It is the worst thing I could imagine seeing. I think it is horrible. Everything you read in the Bible, right? Everything, Old Testament, New Testament, whatever it is, only talks about how do you're measured by what do you do for the worse off people in the world. But just again and again, and it says, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, house the home. I mean, this is just what it says again and again and again. And somehow or another, we've got people up there talking about cutting taxes for the rich and don't give people, politics, don't give people, God forbid we give people health care because God doesn't want them to have health care. Like, I just don't get it at all. Like, the worst thing in the world that this guy has ever done is he's given people access to doctors. So I think that, you know, which side you're on or whatever, I think that you cannot point to one place that I've ever seen in any religious text that justifies not sharing, not taking care of the most needy. And you know, if there is a gate to heaven, it is not bought by accumulating the most wealth.
Oh, that's great.
So,
I'll agree with that. All of that. I think that the Old Testament has many echoes of that. Sometimes not an echo, but a roar, like in Amos. And when you look at New Testament, it's just all that. The God is caring for the marginalized. His missionary goal is to reach out in that direction. He calls us to do this. Let me just speak a little bit about capitalism. I think it's important for you to, you know, just intellectually think about what it is. You know, I have an article called "The Magic of Markets," and think about. So what is it about? So we've had a number of experiments. So, for example, East Germany, West Germany. Okay, North Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, China for a long time. You know, you control for the genetics, you control for everything. What is it about the free enterprise system that generates more opportunities and so therefore greater wealth or greater well-being? So the notion of, you know, people say capitalism is this horrible, evil thing because it's capitalistic, right? But the idea, and the economists that study this would tell you, the idea is just that if you put a few simple rules in place, people acting out of their own self-interest will end up efficiently allocating resources and talent and capital in such a way that the total pie grows bigger. Okay? It's better than centralized planning. Okay, so I haven't got to anything biblical yet. I'm just sort of laying out sort of the groundworks for thinking like an economist, right? Then, when you look at what the Bible teaches, right, its funny thing is it isn't about how to make the pie bigger. It's about how the pies should be shared, especially when you have control of a certain part of the pie, right? It's about how you should spend, how you should use, how you should give, right? And it keeps telling you that you should be making other people better off. And the thing I want to ask you is, why is it that we need to be told that over and over and over again? Why is it that in the human development as a species, we didn't suddenly just say, well, that's the logical thing. The equilibrium is for me to be selfless. So how do we solve this fundamental problem in the human heart that continues to be self-centered, as opposed to being, let's say, the alternative in Genesis 1 and 2, where we were God-centered? How do we get to the point where we're not just trying to mitigate the damage that somebody else has done, meanwhile committing other types of problems ourselves, and actually just deal with sort of the root causes? And what Christianity asserts, the one that I think about, is that there's a real fundamental problem in society, and it came because we were separated from God. We were originally God-centered creatures, and things worked. Now we are self-centered, and when we're self-centered, we have to put in a lot of rules to make sure we don't hurt other people, and then we keep legislating so that, you know, we should do more for these things. But you can't legislate love. You can only legislate sort of, you can't do this, or I'm going to take X% of your income and give it to someone else. How do you change the thing that makes someone want to love someone else? Motivated to do this. And God's claims, or the Christian claim, is that God did this. You know, when you look at all the suffering and all the problems in the Bible, the first 2 chapters had no suffering. And if you look at the last 2 chapters in the New Testament and Revelation, there's no suffering either. But everything in between, well, not so pretty, right?
So how's that working, this love thing, as opposed to setting some rules in place to stop people from taking it all?
So there is definitely no conflict between setting the right rules and telling people what the problem is and how God deals with it. I don't think there's any conflict. In fact, I'm 100% behind I wish, you know, people. So whether you're a Christian or any, you need to act out your conviction, right? Otherwise, you will end up with a soul that shrivels. that's just the way the soul works. The wellness of the soul has something to do with your heart, your mind, your body being at the same place on the same wavelength and doing the same thing. The same, and hopefully, in my view, I think what God wants you to do.
So I live by this rule that says, pray like everything depends on God, and act like everything depends on you.
I think that's fantastic.
And so to me, we've got to get in there and change these rules of capitalism. Because while I love capitalism, I'm an econometrics major, I have an MBA in finance from Wharton, I have 18 years of Wall Street. We have given government and rulemaking over to rich. That's what we've done in this country, and that is not free enterprise. That is rigging the game against the poor. And that is something that we're going to have to step up and fix and not hide behind, well, capitalism is good. Because I agree, capitalism is good. It's the best system we've ever seen. But this is unfettered. This goes a little bit beyond.
Okay, so
we're going to have you answer, but also I want to turn and transition it to questions.
Yeah,
so
no,
I
think
think start forming a line while there's a response here.
Okay, so quick response. So there is this very blue thing, and then there's this very red thing in this country. To some extent, I don't think that if you look at the Bible, it tells you that you have to be blue or you have to be red. Okay, so those are ideologies, and Jesus said, "Render unto God what is God's, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." I think that we do need to be passionate about what we think is an injustice, and I happen to. But let me just sort of play the devil's advocate for a moment and just say what I don't want to guess which color you are, but let me just say, let me pick the red side and say what they might say, okay? And we'll say they because anyway, so here's the thing. So suppose you were to come back and say, okay, we understand there's a problem, there's a serious problem. We agree that there's too much disparity, okay? Then the question is, how do you fix it? Okay. Do you fix it because you put more rules in, you tax and do welfare transfers, or do you fix and I think maybe you're suggesting, campaign reform, which I'm 100% for. All those things is one way. Another way, some people would say, is that actually we encourage small business or people who basically actually generate the opportunities for other people in ways that, I don't know, how this is done, how to dismantle the money that's already there. But basically the idea is, you kind of you create the incentives and have the private sector sort of figure it out as opposed to having the public sector act. So I think these are some discussions. The other thing I should point out, because if you were arguing this side, I would argue the other side. So the other thing I should point out is there are two notions of justice, okay? There is one that says every single individual, every image bearer of God deserves certain inalienable rights, and I should do everything to protect them. And I absolutely agree that that's a key refrain in all through God's message to us. But there is another sense of justice, which is that the people who contribute more, who work harder, who actually do more for other people should get more. Okay, not necessarily what we see in the difference between the two, but that is also a notion of justice, because in the absence of that, you actually have a lot of difficulties, creating, because everything has price moves around, not because of any malice, but because there's scarcity, right? So including labor, right? So this notion of markets does sort of, both of these notions of justice are actually, I think, important and need to be thought through. And when you set policies, and policies come and go, ideologies come and go. Our root problems of sin and death, they don't come and go. They're just there unless they're dealt with.
Well, I hadn't anticipated having a political conversation tonight.
I was going to come here and talk about football, but I decided I'd do something like less controversial, like politics and religion.
Why the Stanford guy doesn't want to talk about football this year. So I do want to have you join me in thanking both of our panelists. And we do want to open it up for questions. We have a mic here, and then we also have index cards floating around if you would rather write down your question instead of actually standing up to ask your question. And so while people are assembling, I just wanted to kind of ask an additional question, I guess, to further stir the pot. There are those who would, in the election, who would actually characterize this as kind of the final days of capitalism. So rather than thinking of, capitalism has just kind of gone amok, and it's the best, right? There are, the folks who agree with Karl Marx that, the seeds of the destruction of capitalism are now, basically the chickens are coming home to roost, which is why we have the disparities that we have. And so I guess the larger question is, why is that resonating with people so much, even though we are very much a nation that still likes to profess having values, having certain kinds of faith values, but this message of anger, this message of disappointment with kind of the economic system is clearly driving the conversation on both the red and the blue sides, frankly. So I didn't know if you had any kind of intimations about why you think that's the case, even though most of us still remain dedicated capitalists for the most part. Why is this communist argument seem to be resonating on some level?
Well, I think one thing, Karl Marx predicted the demise of capitalism many years ago. And I think one of the reasons, because he looked at it as, the rich is going to keep getting richer, the poor is going to get poorer. And I do think that the legislating of certain rules and laws that transfer, for example, estate tax and so on, is actually, I think it's very consistent with the year of Jubilee and the Old Testament, everything, so that the forgiveness of sin, the forgiveness and the setting the slaves free. It's just as, we want to keep that. And I think the teachings of Christianity, traditional background, of systemic philanthropy is actually pretty unusual when you look around the world. And it just happens that Christianity and capitalism have sort of gone along. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the Christian teaching is all about giving it away, and that the worth, that money isn't to be trusted, and money isn't even yours. You're just a steward. Just give it quickly, give it freely, give it quietly. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's done. And I think that actually made a big difference in terms of why capitalism has continued, because Marx would have predicted that we were done a long time ago.
But I'll say that I cannot find a period of time in history when there was this level of extreme difference between the wealthy and the poor, where the poor did not end up rising up and chopping the heads off the rich and storming the castle. There's never been in history, and we are close to that precipice. And a lot of what I see is just, that anger out there, and that is just the very beginnings, I think, of this, what I think is unsustainable. You have to look back at history, and it just doesn't work.
Thank you. I'm looking for Deanna. Deanna, are you here? Hi. We've asked you, would you mind asking your question? Deanna is a junior from the Price School, and she is also a member of La Fe. And so, Deanna, please.
So my question is, this is like a little bit of context that I'll put in, but when students come to USC, they're given narratives such as, if you're attending USC, you probably never experienced failure before. But those run counter to the experiences of many students in the Latino community. Oh, sorry, I'll go slower. As a first-generation college student growing up in a low-income household with undocumented parents, I lived surrounded with failure. I experienced homelessness and constantly felt the effects of my family's wage instability. All the while, I also had to grapple with navigating the college application process, something completely foreign to me, who didn't even know what the SATs were, let alone how to sign up for them. And to be honest, I didn't even get an average score, and I felt that I needed to hide these failures in my life, and I still do, because they don't fit into the greater narrative of students who do get accepted to USC. So my questions are, And it's kind of like 3 parts, and you might not cover them all, but what insight would you give to students like myself who are seeking to bring these marginalized narratives that are full of failure to the forefront? How can this be done in a way that's empowering rather than shameful? And what advice would you have for the university in better serving student populations that look like me?
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. Wonderful question. Now you sort of understand why we wanted her to go first. That's an amazing question to kick off this discussion. So I don't know which of you might like to start.
Well, you want to apply to Stanford, maybe? Yeah. So
Slow down, Ace. She's ours. You're not returning with any of our good students like Deanna.
It's funny that, you think of those things as failures because it doesn't fit some of the narrative that you feel is part of the neighborhood. But I don't see them as failures. It's almost like, when they grow grapes for wine, sometimes they deliberately stress the grapes because the flavor is different. And what you have described to me is something incredibly precious. What you go through, what you have described, is to me not only should be precious to a school because of what you bring to this group. I would encourage you not to hide these things because they are badges. And I think that in God's eyes, it's also true that the wine that comes out of your press is going to be richer. And I wish that, and I do think that we get a clearer sense of the world we live in when we go through difficulties, because it must be pretty screwed up in order for God to be willing to die for it, We could have fixed it in less messy way. He probably would have fixed it that way. And I am sincere. I wish Stanford admitted more people. Maybe they do. I just don't know. With backgrounds where people had to overcome difficulties. So.
Want to take a step maybe at the U.S.
Yeah, sure.
part too?
So first, congratulations on making it here. And I'm serious. I challenged my MBA class last night with another student. Go back to high school, go to Manual Arts High School, which is just a few blocks away from here, and try to get your ass to SC and see if you can pull it off. Because I know for 9 out of 10 of them, they wouldn't have a shot at being here. So congratulations on pulling that off. That's really something. And then the second is I was with Dr. Ainsley Carey the other day, who's a good friend of mine who runs student affairs, is vice provost of student affairs. And I just want to say, I'll take the talk for him. If there's anything we can be doing to make this experience better for you while you're here, if we are not being sensitive enough to the fact that this is tougher, without a doubt, then jump up and yell it at us, whisper at us, tell us, email me, we'll make it happen because we are vested in your success. We are nothing if you don't succeed. We've done nothing here if all we did is take rich white kids and make them richer. So God bless, you're the reason I'm here. Please don't be quiet, don't hide, let your voice be heard.
Thank you. I think the only thing I would add is really to be vocal about reshaping what it means to be successful. I think one of the things that we often underestimate in the undocumented community and the immigrant community more broadly, and I'm marrying into an immigrant community, my sister is already married into an immigrant community, is really the degree to which you're not just kind of rethinking success, but you're also carrying hopes and dreams of so many people, and that really does become not just a challenge, but also, hard to bear sometimes, right? So there has to be these moments and these spaces where you really can't let your hair down, and it's okay if one thing doesn't go well or if something doesn't go well. It's easy to put too much pressure on yourself, in other words. And so the idea isn't to then say, oh, it's okay to fail all the time, but it's okay to not be perfect all the time, I think is the challenge, right? And so one of the great things about, being a person of faith or being someone who, kind of thinks that you don't have to be perfect all the time as a recovering perfectionist, is to really say, it's okay to be open about that, right? It's okay to kind of say, yeah, I did not make it through my to-do list today because, somebody called me and they needed me. I needed to take my nieces and nephews here, because another niece was sick or something like that. And that needs to be okay to say and okay to live, not just kind of, hold in or not share with your faculty members, not share with your professors. And as someone who sits on the academic senate here, if there's something that faculty need to be trained about or sensitized about, then we need to make that happen, right? Because I'm one faculty member in Dornsife, he's one faculty member in Marshall. There might be others who have no idea, right, what this is like. And so when you go to them, they don't hear it the way that we would hear it. And we need to know about those examples so that we can develop better orientations for our faculty, that our population is really diverse. So again, thanks for that question. Yes, please, hi.
Thank you all for coming and sharing from your lives. So Dr. Wertman, you used the quote that you wanted to take your gifts and use them to enhance the lives of others and went to Skid Row. Since you both have decades on Wall Street, is there a way of taking your gifts to help others on Wall Street? That's question one. And
unredeemable.
I'm
only kidding.
Well, I believe you can, but I want to hear how you think we can. And then secondly, if we nonetheless feel called to the nonprofit sector, how does one do that, live in LA, send 3 kids to a top university, and not have a professorship? So how does one do that tangibly? Because it feels almost like a tension between 2 definitions of success.
So I have a master's in social entrepreneurship program that we have here. And that's all we're doing is training people to do this work. And it is affordable, and you can get paid. My students are getting paid well. My MBAs going into nonprofits are all getting, I think our average salary, entering salary 2 years ago, was the last numbers I have, was $111,000. We have more jobs than I have students. Jessica Jackley, a professor at Stanford, actually told Jessica this, and she passed it on to me. Jessica's the co-founder of Kiva, who teaches for me here. Jessica's professor said to her, "You're a really, really smart person. You've figured out a lot of things in this world. Don't be intellectually lazy about how you're going to live while doing good work in the world. You can figure it out." So it's not, if your passion and your calling is calling you to nonprofit work, come to my office, we'll get you a job, go do it, man, and you'll figure it out. I worked on Wall Street for 18 years. I worked for the last 16 years with people, a lot of whom are in nonprofit, the vast majority are nonprofit. Trust me, the people in the nonprofit are 50 times happier than the people who are just devoting their lives to making money. And that happiness cannot have a price tag on it.
Do you want to say something briefly?
Is there a way to do good? Yeah, so I don't know. I guess I was never, I was visiting economists in New York Stock Exchange, but that didn't really blend me into the local Wall Street scene. I was sitting there, a geek guy, sitting there doing my research. But, and when I managed money, I was in San Francisco, so it wasn't, and actually all we did was manage assets. So lots of people, including probably a lot of the professors here, because so CalPERS and so forth. My sense of it wasn't the same. I did not see them as unredeemable. We actually had a lot of, I think if I felt that way, I would have left very.
Yeah, I don't think people on Wall Street are evil. And when I talked about whether they were happy or not is a different question.
Well, that's again. So I would say that there's a lot of variation, and because human beings are human beings. There's cultures, but firms have cultures, not just entire streets or sort of biospheres. So if you don't think that the biosphere you are in is something whose value you subscribe to, or then you can't do anything about that systemic corruption, then you should definitely leave. But I just don't actually, it's not been my experience that in the asset management business, people are just generally unhappy. I think that, here's the way I think about it. The way I tell my students is, the pursuit of happiness cannot be separated from the pursuit of virtue. Okay? Because if you try to pursue happiness or money or whatever else, without thinking about the more amorphous and difficult issue about what it means to be good, then you'll end up in a very selfish place in which you have neither. And that applies whether you're in Wall Street or whether you're in private sector. God, I mean, the private sectors that I've worked with, and I worked with a number of them, many of them have a lot of problems. Actually, same problems, because human beings are human beings.
If you ask me who's worse, Wall Street or people who sell sugar water to babies, I'd go with sugar water people. Is a bigger moral problem for me. Most of the people I know on Wall Street, the vast majority of my, these are not immoral people. These are not bad people. They are people just like us. They're just, it's an amoral decision. Is it legal? Am I allowed to do this? I do it. And it's sort of just the way business works. So I mean, there's bad apples in every business. There's bad apples, trust me, on this campus and on every campus. The answer is that I think Wall Street's been unnecessarily vilified. It's not a bad, these aren't bad people. They're just, they're people.
I think there's a couple of interesting theories there too about conscientious capitalism and some other, impact investing, some other ways to kind of blend the best of both worlds that we could also talk about. But I also know that there are at least 6 people in line.
Yeah.
So please, thank you.
So I want to preface this by saying that I'm not sure if this is the proper place to ask this, but I feel like it's provocative and I feel like it needs to be asked because I'm sure maybe some other people potentially are also feeling this. So I'm a Jew. I would probably also say that as my first kind of identifier, so I also laughed at all your Jew jokes, which were great. But I also am pursuing social work, and I'm also an atheist. So for someone who is surrounded by a lot of social injustices, you're constantly working with people that are marginalized and having serious things in their lives that you're trying to help them through. I'm having trouble kind of with this discussion because I'm wanting some more diversity, which I don't know if you can provide because you're both, you're a Christian and you believe in God in some way. I'm wondering if you can maybe think back to when you considered yourself more confused or agnostic and kind of think about like, how do you answer this question of work hard, play hard, what does that mean from a perspective of there being nothing, which I know is hard for people who fundamentally believe that there is something. So I don't really know how to phrase that in a better way, but just kind of how do you make the meaning in your life if you don't believe anything without saying believe in something?
So let me just make sure I understand. I do understand. And so
Thank you.
You're an atheist, and you want to know that in that context, how should you answer the question?
Yeah, just basically
Then
like,
what, right.
so if you're not going to God, if you're not going to spirituality, how would you suggest finding success or accomplishments, seeing, hope in things from a completely secular point of view? Which is hard, I know.
Don't be sorry. Thank you for asking.
I would argue it's just all on the work. It's the work of a social worker. It's what you do every day and working harder. What drives you, whether you're driven by God or whether you're driven by a belief, doesn't matter. Again, to me, at least to me, it might be different. I only care what you do every day when you get up in the morning. And are you doing something to make somebody's life better? And as a social worker, you are getting up every morning to make somebody's life better. And I know how hard that is, and I know I spent a lot of time around that suffering, and I get it. But the answer is, you're doing the work. And I'd call you the hand of God. You can call yourself anything you want, but something inside of you is calling you to do this work. And just as long as you keep doing that, I don't need a label, I don't need another reason. I don't think you, obviously, are doing this work without another reason. You just hang in there, keep doing the hard work every day, and see the fruits of your labor for the people whose lives you are touching that will forever be changed.
So I want to make sure we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry to the people who are still in line. We're actually going to have a reception, so you can have time to speak with both of the professors afterwards. Please.
A lot of problems inside the world are due to vices such as greed, pride, arrogance, and the such. So one thing that I've learned, or there's a saying that you're the sum of the 5 people whom you interact with the most. And you two, being very high positioned people, have a lot of room for influence, and a lot of people interact with you. So how does your faith and your profession intersect in terms of cultivating virtue, such that you may be a model to inspire others towards having a pure heart?
And also, if there are other final comments you want to offer, please feel free to wrap those in too, to either of you who wants to start.
Well, it's always a little spooky to be said, to say, well, you're in a position of influence, what are you doing? That's always a little scary. When I talk to my wife and my dog, they don't seem to agree that I have a lot of influence. But I have a hard time getting my dog to do anything. But I do think that your question, I mean, it's a really good, serious question. I think that for me, I want to offer that which I consider most worthy of offering. And in my case, and in my life, and in my experience, it is the authenticity of Jesus. For me, all those other things, we should do everything we can for it, but there is a need that is actually really deep, and it's a personal one. And so therefore, in addition to doing things that I think that I should do and I'm called to do, I feel like, you know, if I was blind and now I see, I got to tell people that I was blind and now I see, and here's the way I see it and why. And so I talk about with my students things like, human beings have intrinsic value. I mean, it's an assertion. But to me, it's a first derivative of the fact that God became incarnate and died for us. I mean, it's just a corollary. Human beings must have. It's not functional value. It's not commercial value. They just have value. And if you actually go through life like that, you're going to make a lot of better decisions. It's not what they can do for you. It's just that they just are intrinsically valuable. When you treat people around you like that, it makes a difference. And so there are certain sort of principles, certain things like invest in the success of the people around you, which you may think, well, if I invest in everybody else's success, I'm going to look pretty bad. But if God is God and he did what he did, it actually makes a lot of sense because he's going to take care of you. And it turns out that when you invest in people around you, things work out all right. Some people just have green thumbs. Everybody around them is green. And when that happens, things work out all right. So I don't think I'm a great role model. It scares me that I would even be a role model. On the other hand, I think what I feel like I owe is to people around me is to offer that which I consider most valuable, which is what I try to do.
Professor Wertman?
Nice, easy question for the last question. I get up every morning, I brush my teeth, I take a shower, I feed my dog, I make coffee, I go to work. That's the day I see of myself. I don't necessarily envision my life like a bio. I just go about my life and get up every morning and struggle through another day. Days are struggles. I treat every person like an angel. I do a lot of meetings every week because I don't think I have the right to say no so if any of my students are in the room, they know this. I don't think I have the right to say no to anybody, especially people who reach out to me, the vast majority of whom want advice on how to do good things in the world, and I don't have the I don't think I have the right to look at them and say, no, I'm too busy to help you save the world. Like, I just don't have that half hour in my life. So I work extraordinarily hard. I just think that it all, Martin Buber, a great Jewish philosopher, talks about finding God in the I-thou relationship. If you want to find God, this is where God exists. This is where God exists. This is where God exists. And I focus all of that on my relationships with people, my interactions with people, on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day. I feel remarkably humbled by every person I meet. And the idea of somebody, you saying we're in positions of power or whatever, I go through life feeling like I'm nobody. I really do. And I think that keeping that humility, which for me, I deserve that humility, 'cause I am nobody. But keeping that around you at all times, staying humble, but being of service. And how can I be of service? It's what Professor Lee said. It's what we've heard tonight. How can you be of service? If you keep that front of mind, that will be a great life.
Investing in others, treating everyone as angels. I'm reminded of that big picture that's been going around on the internet that has the difference between a boss and a leader. A boss is kind of sitting from behind and, the people are pulling along the boss, but a leader is out there pulling the chariot with the coworkers, with the team. And the reason that really strikes me and resonates with me is because of this idea of investing in others really being the path to this version of success that's more meaningful than just more money and more business. And I really also think it's an important note to end on because our late president, Stephen Sample, was a professor of leadership and really had an expertise in leadership. So USC students, we're kind of educating you to be leaders, and you probably came to us as leaders in some sense. But hopefully this evening has really allowed you to rethink what it might mean to lead, but become what we call, at least in the Christian faith, a servant leader. And so please join me again in thanking both of our panelists.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.